Auschwitz is the most infamous of the death camps of the Holocaust and stands as a chilling symbol of unimaginable cruelty and human suffering. The female guards who contributed to the brutality of the camp are not as well known as the camp's male officers. They complied with their duties with utmost efficiency and absolute obedience. They were in charge of the prisoner camps to enforce a terror regime. When the war ended and the Nazi regime was overthrown, many of these women were tried for the roles they played in the atrocities at Auschwitz. Their executions were a grim but necessary part of the search for justice to avenge the architects of the Holocaust, no matter what gender it may be. But how did their executions change the post-war atmosphere of fear and terror? Today, followers, we will see the tragic end of the most cruel women of Nazi Germany who were responsible for the deaths of many innocent people. Profiles in cruelty, female guards and the horrors of Auschwitz. What happened in Auschwitz-Birkenau can never be forgotten in the history of the Holocaust. Among the perpetrators were a bunch of female guards who transgressed the traditional idea of female, not just intelligent but cruel and dehumanizing. Maria Mandl, Irma Grese, and Elisabeth Volkenrath were infamous in the history of the Nazi machinery of death. These cruel ladies left unforgettable scars on the memories of the survivors. Maria Mandl, also known as the Beast of Auschwitz, served in the SS, holding one of the highest female-ranking positions within the organization. Mandl was the camp's head of the women's camp at Auschwitz-Birkenau, where she oversaw the systematic murder of thousands. She chose who lived and who died. Her participation was direct. Survivors remembered her as a figure of unblemished authority who enforced Nazi ideology with icy precision. Historians said Mandl's brutality was closer to a crazed desire to rise in the Nazi regime hierarchy, even if it meant sacrificing humanity. Auschwitz's hyena, Irma Grese, was known for her sadistic behavior. She was only 19 years old when Grese soon rose through the ranks, despite any idea she possessed of the viciousness with which she treated prisoners. Whether through beatings, shootings, or turning her trained dogs on screaming victims, witnesses said she enjoyed the suffering she administered. A combination of indoctrination she received in the Nazi youth movement and a desire for power and recognition in a system that rewarded such behavior was thought to be the core factor for Grese's cruelty. Her trial showed that she was more or less remorseless and one of the most notorious figures in the camp's history. But there was another senior female guard, Elisabeth Volkenrath, a less implacable but equally shocking brand of cruelty to behold. As a supervisor, she oversaw the inhumane conditions of the women's barracks, where disease and death were common. Volkenrath received a vote as to when executions were to be conducted and was said to be inattentive to the sufferings she witnessed. Some historical evidence proved that her actions were a result of a combination of blind loyalty to the Nazi regime and the dehumanization of her victims, learned through SS training. Irma Grese, the hyena, faces justice for Auschwitz atrocities. This is a chronicle of inhumanity laid down by a lady who became the epitome of horror among the prisoners of Auschwitz concentration camp. Irma Grese was one of the predators at Auschwitz who was fully involved in the killings and torture of thousands of innocent souls. Grese's sadism and youthful ruthlessness gave rise to a new nickname for her, the Hyena of Auschwitz. Her trial, conviction, and finally the execution was a small move in search for justice for the victims of the Holocaust. Former guard at the Auschwitz extermination camp, she was known for her ruthlessness. When she went to trial, it was documented that many survivors' evidence opened her deeds as a dreadful and inhuman one. She chose victims for the gas chambers, and she used to beat some of them and then release her dogs on the victims. Her whip and pistol at her side were indicative of terror because it emphasized her brutal physicality. Psychological evaluations also added another layer of the horror presented at her trial. However, Grese's lawyers argued she was not following orders, and assessments indicated she was cold towards her fellow prisoners and had no remorse. At the time, experts wondered if she was just brainwashed, that she wanted power, or just cruel. The court could not find that she committed the crimes in an accident, as her age would indicate. Rather, her crimes were deliberate and carried out with full knowledge of their consequences. The trial of Irma Grese was a crucial part of the British military tribunal at Lüneburg, for which officers of former staff of Auschwitz and Bergen-Belsen were tried. When asked to defend herself, Grese refused, denying much of the evidence to her. The testimonies of the far too many witnesses and her lack of remorse, compounded with one another, closed the case for her. Then, she was convicted of war crimes and sentenced to death by hanging. Irma Grese was 22 years old when she was executed on December 13, 1945, at Hamelin prison. She appeared neither afraid nor repentant as she came up to the gallows. The end of one of the most infamous figures of the Holocaust came swiftly and unceremoniously, the witnesses to her execution said. On her execution day, the Allied commanders asked several questions regarding her brutal attitude during the war and her cruel behavior towards the prisoners. She did not answer a single question and kept her lips locked until she was thrown in the hell of death. Her execution remained a dark chapter in the history of warfare, as it signified the vengeful emotions of the victims and the Allied forces alike, though the justice was made to the perpetrators of the Auschwitz sufferings. But the problem of female involvements in such brutal acts had always remained an unsolved mystery. Maria Mandl, the orchestrator of death at Auschwitz concentration camp. Maria Mandl was arrested and remembered as the orchestrator of death, playing a significant role in the systematic murder of thousands at Auschwitz-Birkenau. She had been a high-ranking SS officer, joined the prisoner camp as an overseer, and personally took part in the process of sending so many prisoners to the gas chamber. Upon the completion of her trial and execution after World War II, an era of a figure who symbolized the deliberate cruelty of the Nazi regime came to an end. As a Nazi ideologue, Mandl proved herself also a ruthless productive force in the extermination system of the Auschwitz concentration camp. She chose to execute prisoners who weren't seen as fit to work anymore, ordering them to be diverted straight to the extermination camp without further ado. Her presence in the selection process was clearly marked by a cold, detached demeanor in which she weighed human lives on a keen scale. Mandl oversaw those barracks where starvation, disease, and inhumane conditions were the norm, and brutal discipline went beyond selections. The most damning evidence of her role in the camp operations was Nazi documentation. Records showed she was part of a circle that organized the extermination process and kept order in the women's camp. She had no doubt been a figure of terror. Survivor accounts corroborated her actions. During the visits, Mandl showed no emotion as families were forced apart and recalled directing women and children into gas chambers. American forces captured Mandl after the war, then deported to Poland to face trial. She was charged at the Krakow trials in 1947 with war crimes and crimes against humanity. The survivors testified at her trial in a grim and vivid recounting of her brutality. Mandl tried to absolve herself of any blame and said she was doing what she was being told. But the massive amounts of evidence, which included her role in the business of forced deportations, left no doubt. When her trial was in progress, she was asked to admit to the crimes she committed, and wishfully she would be pardoned, or her execution would be postponed. But sadly, she did not even utter a single word about her role and her participation in the acts of cruelty which were administered at Auschwitz camp under her supervision. Till the end, until she was hanged, her attitude remained crude, and she just murmured some words. "I was obeying the orders of the High Command." Mandl was convicted and sentenced to death. On January 24, 1948, she was hanged at Montelupich prison in Krakow. She didn't even show remorse toward her execution, witnesses to her execution said. Elisabeth Volkenrath, commanding cruelty and death at Auschwitz camp. The most notorious SS female guard at Auschwitz was Elisabeth Volkenrath. She was known, among other things, for her cruelty and was directly responsible for how prisoners were treated, whether afflicted with torture, forced labor, or death. Volkenrath, one of the most feared figures at Auschwitz, was tried and executed after the war as one of the perpetrators of war crimes. However, they kept a last mark of painful suffering. At Auschwitz, Volkenrath commanded brutal action taken against women and children, who were often made to work in the alternatives or sent straight to the gas chambers. Survivor testimonies of prisoners highlighted that she was involved in the process of relentless selection and sorting of the prisoners to be sent into the gas chambers. She was cruel to prisoners, once beating and carrying out other inhuman ways to make the camp's terrible conditions worse. During her trial, one of the most damning pieces of evidence against Volkenrath was survivors who detailed how she had been part of the torture cycle and killed many of the prisoners. One survivor complained that Volkenrath personally beat prisoners sadistically. She took part in deporting Jews and then supervising their execution, and together, Nazi documentation of her activities in the camp, and this testimony painted a picture of a woman who was not just following orders, but a woman who reveled in the power and cruelty inherent in the leadership of a camp. In her 1945 trial, Volkenrath defended herself and said she only obeyed the commands. She said she had little choice but to follow the directives of her superiors as a low-ranking guard. Many Nazi war criminals on trial after the war made the common argument that such obedience to orders was a consideration in defense. But the overwhelming proof of her hand in the atrocity, plus the testimonies of the survivors, damaged her innocence claims. The Tribunal for War Crimes and Crimes Against Humanity convicted her. Elisabeth Volkenrath was hanged with Irma Grese and other infamous female guards in Nazi atrocities on December 13, 1945. When she was executed, witnesses said she remained calm and composed with no guilt at the pain she had inflicted on others. Her death, eventually, was the end of a name forever linked with cruelty, oppression, and mass killings within the walls of Auschwitz. Margot Drexel, the unseen hand of Auschwitz's brutality. While not as significantly remembered as some of her SS colleagues, Margot Drexel did have a significant and cruel role at Auschwitz. In the Nazi death machine, she was a full participant in the horrors. Many consider Drexel one of the more unsung perpetrators at Auschwitz. However, her role in the brutality was just as important to the suffering of prisoners as was the case with those higher-profile faces. This was totalitarian cruelty insofar as she was, as part of the official administrative structure, involved in the daily operations of the death camp, such as the selection and dispatch of the prisoners to the gas chambers and the overseeing of forced labor. She was famous for her role as an SS female guard at Auschwitz, who supervised the mistreatment of women and children inside the camp. She was made to do her jobs, which included making sure prisoners stuck to strict and brutal regulations that always brought the inmates untold suffering. Later, survivors testified to her cruelty, saying she threatened and routinely oversaw punishments, regularly beaten prisoners, and monitored deportations with inhuman ferocity. However, unlike a few of her peers with more immediately recognizable names, Drexel's actions were no less horrible. At Auschwitz, she was behind some of the most unspeakable crimes, supervising the forced working of women and selecting women for the gas chambers without remorse. Drexel's ability to do such cruelty with silence, almost invisibly, set her apart. While others of her colleagues were known for exquisite displays of violence, she was not known for rambunctious displays but for relatively efficient and brutal cutting. This unseen cruelty often sprung behind the scenes, making her actions so insidious. From those who survived her, she was described as an enforcer of the system, ensuring the cycle of death went without ever bringing even a glance upon herself. Margot Drexel was caught up in the post-war effort to bring Nazi war criminals to trial. Survivor testimonies were evidence against her direct involvement in atrocities at the camp. Although she had kept a low profile, the power of the evidence was enough to recognize as a war crime culprit. During her trial period, she hardly spoke about the incidents occurred in Auschwitz camp. Her rigidness, repulsion against her trial, and body language never changed until she was finally convicted by the tribunal. Margot Drexel was hanged in 1945 for the crimes which she committed, and for the hundreds of thousands of lives that she snuffed out under her rule at the concentration camp. Whereas other butchery queens became part of folklore, there was no rhyme about Drexel's name in history, but her rigid nature. She remained a figure of tyranny and horror for those who witnessed her brutality, especially during her stay in the Auschwitz camp. Juana Bormann, the ruthless enforcer of Auschwitz's horrors. One of the most feared camp enforcers among the brutal SS at Auschwitz was Juana Bormann, whose existence was a horror. As a camp supervisor, she was a vital part of the organizational bent of cruelty to the prisoners, particularly women and children. She ensured, however, to cement her place as one of the darkest of characters in Auschwitz's history, where she emerged as horrible, ruthless, and sadistic. In her time working at Auschwitz, Bormann had engaged in activity as an administrator of terror. However, She had been the one to be in charge of the forced labor of women and children, many of whom were enslaved and subjected to constant brutalized punishments. She punished prisoners for any offense whatsoever, often physically, sometimes in gas chambers. The selection of the unfit for work was her function, directly responsible for the extermination of innumerable innocent people. What made Bormann's abuse so chilling was that she looked as if she didn't have any empathy. To those who survived, she was the calculating, cold-hearted girl with no conscience for anyone's life. Her indifference to the suffering of others was also emblematic of the programmatic, dehumanizing ethos of the whole of the Nazi regime. The programmatic value of efficiency, of committing or carrying out atrocity over the value of human life. Bormann was apprehended after the war ended and tried for her role at Auschwitz during the time of the atrocities. Like most other SS personnel, she claimed on trial that she had merely been following orders. While there was nothing to defend, the overwhelming evidence of her part in the nasty practices at Auschwitz, as well as survivor testimony, meant there was very little to which she could plead. She was convicted of war crimes and crimes against humanity, and condemned for participating in the murder and mistreatment of prisoners in a ruling by the tribunal. Before her final execution, she was asked by the Allied commanders whether she had any last wish. Wanner did not respond and kept herself stagnant while she was sitting on a stone bench in the death cell. The Allied officers kept on scolding her for the brutality she rendered upon the victims of Auschwitz camp, but she showed no signs of regrets. Wanner Bormann was eventually hanged on December 13, 1945, until her death came like a black shadow for her. The people who witnessed her execution narrated that she had a very cruel personality, and she had no feelings of remorse for what she committed was the greatest crimes against humanity. Her death ended a career of cruelty and blind obedience to the Nazi regime's harsh ethics. Hertha Ehlert, the unforgiving hand behind Auschwitz's silent deaths. Standing out among the male SS guards at Auschwitz, Hertha Ehlert was a female SS guard who did much to help carry out the camp's horrors, and gladly aided and abetted the brutal torture and murders of so many prisoners. She was a key player, her vicious assaults well known in the organized cruelty that came to be a stamp of the Nazi death camp. But justice would be sought out only after the war, when her role in countless atrocities was known. But Ehlert's ruthless reign of terror took a grim end when Ehlert was executed. After the war, Hertha Ehlert was captured, tried, and convicted of her war crimes. Like many other SS officers, she defended herself in a trial by saying she had only done what she had been ordered to do. All that was dispelled, however, by the overwhelming evidence of her involvement in the atrocities at Auschwitz and the testimonies of survivors. Ehlert had performed selections for the gas chambers, participated in acts of physical violence, and helped create the daily routine of systematic cruelty. The survivors recounted how she ignored human life to torment prisoners at her direct hands. Her trial was a result of the Allied forces' determination to bring Nazi perpetrators to justice, and as happened to the other men tried, there would be no leniency for those who had been involved in the genocidal schemes of the regime. The tribunal found Ehlert guilty of crimes against humanity, of mass murder, torture, and the other abuses committed against prisoners. She was sentenced to death by hanging for these crimes and would join a number of the most famous figures from the Auschwitz camp who met the same fate. When she went to the gallows on December 13, 1945, Hertha Ehlert was one of a group of high-ranking female Nazi officers tried, along with others who had been directly involved in the atrocities at Auschwitz. Witness reports of her last moments before her death described that Ehlert appeared to be utterly calm by her perception of death. It was also said she did not express any guilt or feelings of sadness for her actions or for the suffering she had inflicted on many innocent people. Dorothea Binz, the cruel enforcer of Auschwitz's women's suffering. The memory of Dorothea Binz, a notorious SS guard at Auschwitz, was of a ruthless woman in the dissolution of the suffering of the camp women. Binz, though, was known as a member of the infamous Auschwitz Maidens, which established a reputation for mercilessly enforcing the camp's brutal policies, especially for female prisoners. By her sadistic nature and her acts of violence, her reputation as one of the most feared figures in the camp was well established. Binz was arrested after the war and was put on trial for her crimes. Just like SS officers, she claimed she was merely following orders. But in the trial, where overwhelming evidence included survivor testimonies, Binz's active participation in the horrors at Auschwitz did not have a more damning picture. The survivors detailed how she was cruel to others and often personally oversaw the torture of women, sending many to their deaths without a second thought. It wasn't just that Binz was obeying orders. It was a consequence of a built-in sadism that left a lasting scar on those who lived through it. Dorothea Binz was prosecuted and convicted of a long list of war crimes, including direct participation in the murders of thousands of innocent prisoners. Many of her fellow SS guards convicted of roles in the Holocaust were sentenced to death, just like Binz. She was executed on May 2, 1947, at the Hamelin prison in Germany, where several high-ranking Nazi officers and female guards were found guilty of what they had committed. Binz remained calm and composed when she was executed. Witnesses said Binz differed from colleagues who appeared to show fear, or maybe remorse, as they faced their final moments. The same cruel detachment she had shown when she was at Auschwitz is reflected in her lack of emotion in the face of death. She showed no sign of panic nor remorse for her crimes as she was led to the gallows. Binz maintained a cold, clinical, indifferent look on her face. For the camp survivors, her execution was a sign of justice prevailed. Many people who suffered hardships and violence at the hands of Binz remembered her as a horrifying personality who never showed mercy to the women and the old persons. Her sinful actions were never forgotten by the victims of Auschwitz camp, but any amount of justice could never row out the pain. Alice Orlowski, the silent architect of Auschwitz's brutal regime. One of the lesser-known but horribly feared female SS guards to ever turn up at the machinery of Auschwitz was Alice Orlowski. Although Orlowski's name did not have the same ring to it as did figures such as Irma Grese or Maria Mandl, her presence added no less to what was inflicted and to whom by the cruelty and suffering in Auschwitz. Her job was mainly with the female prisoners, arranging labor details and participating in the merciless paring down of who would live and who would be taken to the gas chambers. In the camp, Orlowski supervised forced laborers and treated the women with the brutality of the camp. She was also responsible for sending prisoners to death with no care for human life. It was because of her actions, and those of other SS personnel, that the camp continued to function under such a brutal regime. Much like Auschwitz itself and its policies, her disregard for the suffering she caused was cold and heartless, and she upheld them with the same cold efficiency. Orlowski was later arrested after the war for her part in the Auschwitz atrocities and put on trial. The testimonies against her were damning of her active part involvement in the massacres and abuse of prisoners. Like many Nazi officials, she claimed that she was only following orders, but contrary to popular belief, it was clear that the evidence was overwhelmingly against that. Her actions were part of a framework of genocide of Nazi character, and she was found guilty of war crimes and crimes against humanity. As in the case of many of the SS personnel involved in Auschwitz's operations, Alice Orlowski was sentenced to death. On the day of her execution, the atmosphere remained grim. According to reports from witnesses who attended the execution, Orlowski came across as cold and unrepentant, like she was in Auschwitz. She was led to the gallows, but there were no signs of fear on her face nor any feeling of remorse. Orlowski's life was turned into death rapidly when her body was allowed to hang beneath the trapdoor. Her execution was cold and quiet in the way she carried herself in her work as an enforcer at Auschwitz. For those who survived Auschwitz, her death was like those of so many other Nazi war criminals, a moment of closure, but it could never erase the scars of horror she helped perpetuate. In particular, the execution of Orlowski was a painful reminder that even the arms of the most silent architects of cruelty end up in justice. Therese Rosie Brandl, the unrelenting force behind Auschwitz's brutality. One of the female SS guards who was later branded cruel and terrorized by her time in the Auschwitz concentration camp was Therese Rosie Brandl. As a female prisoner supervisor, Brandl oversaw forced labor and most notoriously participated in the selections from which thousands were led to the gas chambers. Although she was not as well known among other female perpetrators, she enjoyed a reputation in the camp as implacable and cruel. Brandl's relentless application to her duties was a significant part of the terror that followed Auschwitz, and its inmates faced unimaginable torture. Brandl's conduct about Auschwitz revealed much about the sadistic behavior of many of its agents. She was some way into running the process in which prisoners were rushed and sorted between fit for forced labor and death. Brandl's indifference to human life was like that of many SS guards. She was ready to see prisoners, including women and children, leave the camp without hesitation or regret. She played a crucial part in enabling Auschwitz to function as a camp by her participation in the atrocities carried out there, which brought an unimaginable number of innocent people to their deaths. Brandl was arrested after the war and tried for her crimes at Auschwitz. Her role in the suffering and deaths of prisoners was the overwhelming evidence against her, with shots of survivor testimonies. It portrayed a woman who was war-hardening in the more brutal policies, and a woman who viewed the prisoners not as people but as expendable objects. Brandl said the same thing that many of her fellow guards did: "I was carrying out orders." She was convicted of war crimes, but testimony from survivors and overwhelming documentation from the Nazis themselves did the work. For her part in what amounted to Auschwitz atrocities, Therese Brandl was given a death sentence. On the day she was to be executed, the atmosphere was one of justice, with survivors of the camp finding they no longer had to carry the pain. Brandl was hanged, and there was no fear or regret when she stood before the gallows. Brandl's life was extinguished the moment the trapdoor opened. There was no act of drama and no outburst of remorse for the misery she had inflicted on them. This was the end of one more chapter in the post-war efforts to get Nazi war criminals to account. The execution of the female guards of Auschwitz is a terrifying litany of brutality carried out within the camp, and their unshakable duty in the acts. Though their actions had led to such enormous suffering, their trials and their subsequent executions represented trying to bring justice to the victims of the Holocaust. But these women's deaths were as much a finale to a lengthy road toward justice as any execution could be. These stories, though too often forgotten, are about the most important people to keep in mind, so the atrocities at Auschwitz can never be forgotten and never repeated.